Nuremberg, The Last Battle by David Irving. Chapter 1, in which Stalin says no to murder. As the C-54 cargo plane of the U.S. Army droned eastwards across the Atlantic, a smell of coffee roused the 16 passengers from an uncomfortable sleep. But Justice Robert H. Jackson had not slept since leaving Washington at midday, when the Supreme Court had adjourned for the summer recess after a hectic week of last-minute appeals. Behind the round, gold-rimmed spectacles, the broad forehead was creased by a worried frown. The usually humorous mouth was set in an expressionless line. It was June the 18th, 1945. 2 weeks earlier, the President of the United States had entrusted him with the prosecution of the principal war criminals in Allied hands, and he and his hand-picked staff of lawyers, intelligence officers, and personal secretaries were flying to London on the first leg of the assignment. To Jackson, this was an unique opportunity to push out the frontiers of international jurisprudence, to encompass new areas hitherto beyond its pale. He was going to lay the foundations of a new kind of law, outlawing wars of aggression and making the very conspiracy to wage wars a crime against international law. He wanted to punish the entire organizations that had furnished to Adolf Hitler his temporary successes, such as the German General Staff and the SS, and not just the individuals whose conventional criminality could be established under common law. Behind him, in the United States, the controversy over his ambitions was just beginning. How would he persuade the British to agree, let alone the French or the Russians? Each nation had its own agenda. He entertained few doubts about the magnitude of the task he had set himself. The heavy transport plane descended through the clouds, passed over Ireland, and then droned on further eastwards into England. The pilot had obtained permission for them to circle London once, so that they could see the areas damaged by German bombing. As the plane rolled to a halt on the airfield at Bovingdon, 18 hours after its takeoff from Labrador, Jackson turned to his son, Ensign William Jackson, a Navy lawyer attached to his staff for this historic mission. "Bill," he warned him, "you're going to be defending me long after I am gone." He took the cup of coffee offered to him. "That's why I want you to be there," he said. "I want you to see what it was all like." People just did not come any more American than Robert H. Jackson. It was once unkindly said of Clement Attlee by Winston Churchill, the master of the poisoned parliamentary barb, that he was a modest man with much to be modest about. Jackson, too, was modest, but with much that he could be proud of, too. He was a plain man who had started his professional life as a country lawyer in the Pennsylvania town where he had been born on February the 13th, 1892. His great-grandfather had settled the township of Spring Creek in Pennsylvania, and his grandfather and father had been born on the same farm as he. In 1913, he had hung out his shingle as a lawyer at Jamestown in upstate New York, where his father ran a livery stable. He never did take his law degree, and he tried his first case, defending 4 trade unionists, and won it before he was even admitted to the bar. He qualified as a lawyer by hands-on practice alone. Despite his youth, Jackson developed a large trial practice and became a familiar figure in the New York appellate courts. His politics were left-wing liberal. Very early on, he had become a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. A model New Deal lawyer, Jackson had led the antitrust assaults on the big business combines in the United States. In Washington, his career seemed to climb as inexorably as the morning sun. In 1934, Henry R. Morgenthau, Jr., the urbane and civilized Secretary of the Treasury, invited him to become General Counsel of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. It was said of Jackson that he was a man of urgent idealism and not without personal ambitions. But as a true Democrat, he never wavered in his support for Roosevelt, whom he described in 1939 as the greatest natural resource we have. By 1940, he was being openly tipped by newspapers as a possible future president himself. For the time being, he was content to be a major legal figure. In July 1941, Roosevelt appointed him to the Supreme Court. On that exalted bench, Jackson was cherished and renowned for his forthright dissenting opinions. For example, he could opine at the height of World War II that the Supreme Court was wrong to allow the military to set aside the Bill of Rights in evicting all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was racial discrimination, in his view, and as Roosevelt's Attorney General, he had forbidden all wiretapping operations by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. They had carried on tapping all the same. Topping just 5 feet 8.5 inches, with brown hair and blue eyes, Jackson was like many American countryfolk, a man of limited horizons, a criticism that could be levelled at most of the Nazi leadership too. He had rarely travelled outside the United States. His last passport, issued 10 years before, had been lost years earlier, and he had needed to get a new one for this trip. If there was one man on whom the Germans could count to give them a fair trial, it seemed to be this man, convinced that the United States had a solemn, almost God-granted duty to educate the world, to reward the good, and to punish the evil with an element of righteousness which his country could still afford in 1945, if not in more recent times. Equally, if there was one man on whom President Harry S. Truman could count to set the trials in motion and see them through to their completion, it was Jackson. Even before his appointment by Truman, Jackson had attacked the cynics who had expected war crimes tribunals to act merely as extended weapons of war. He had initially come out against any such trial. "If we want to shoot Germans as a matter of policy," he had said in one speech as the fighting in Europe sputtered to an end, "let it be done as such, but don't hide the deed behind a court. If you are determined to execute a man in any case, there is no occasion for a trial. The world yields no respect to courts that are merely organized to convict." It would bring the law into contempt, he argued, if mock tribunals were held with the verdict already decided. "I expressed the opinion," he recalled 2 weeks later in his diary, "that if these persons were to be executed, it should be as the result of military or political decisions." In this courageous view, that there must be due and proper process, Jackson stood virtually alone at first, for this was the early summer of 1945, and the world's newspapers were full of photographs and vivid eyewitness stories of the horrors revealed in the former Nazi-occupied countries and extermination camps. The air was loud with the cry for immediate, summary, and violent revenge on the perpetrators of these crimes. Tens of millions had been sacrificed to the termagant of war. Stalin would claim to Churchill at Potsdam that the Soviet Union had suffered nearly 5 million losses in killed and missing. Of 5,700,000 Russians taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht, only some 2 million had survived. This is why Jackson felt that it was not enough to single out isolated conventional atrocities and punish the handfuls of low-ranking guilty men, or even their leaders. The criminal organizations themselves had to be indicted. The other cases could be dealt with by existing army court-martial procedure. "These cases I regarded as the small change of crime," he privately recorded. "They were offences that always occur when men are hot, frightened, and passionate." No, Jackson was after the men who had sat at the top, the enemy leaders, who had planned that kind of warfare, who had brutalized it, and who had above all made war itself an instrument of policy. By June 1945, Jackson already had the toughest fight for justice behind him. Firstly, there was President Roosevelt. While he talked eloquently in public of pursuing the Nazi criminals to the ends of the earth, privately he too intended that they should be punished without trial. At a stag dinner held at the White House on June 7, 1944, he had regaled Polish Prime Minister Stanislas Mikołajczyk with stories of Stalin's plans to liquidate 50,000 German officers, and he had laughed out loud as he recalled how his Joint Chiefs had listened with round eyes to these words. Talking, later that evening, about which of the victorious powers should acquire the great North German ports, Henry L. Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, urged Roosevelt to caution. "I felt," Stimson recorded in his diary, in an oblique hint at the ethnic cleansing that would occur after those regions were turned over to the Poles, that repercussions would be sure to arise which would mar the page of our history if we, whether rightly or wrongly, seemed to be responsible for it. Still worried about the bloodbath in store for the defeated Germans, Stimson wrote 2 days later that occupying the southern sector of Germany would be more congenial as it keeps us away from Russia during occupational period. Let her do the dirty work, but don't father it. Such was the climate of hatred that even Cordell Hull, Roosevelt's Secretary of State and a distinguished statesman, argued for nothing less than the summary liquidation of the Axis leaders as and when they fell into Allied hands. "Hull surprised me," admitted the British ambassador Lord Halifax in his secret diary after dining with him on March 16, 1943, by saying that he would like to shoot and physically kill all the Nazi leaders down to quite low levels. In this belief, Hull was on a par with the ambassador's barber in Washington, who perpetually told him, "Kill everyone. Leave one, they will breed again, and you have to do the job again. It is like leaving one rabbit in a young plantation." In the autumn of 1944, Cordell Hull again graphically proposed, "If I had my way, I would take Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo and their arch accomplices and bring them before a drumhead court-martial, and at sunrise on the following day there would occur an historic incident." General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who has a well-manicured image in the history books as a military commander blessed with both chivalry and decency, was little better. He told Lord Halifax on July 10, 1944, that in his view, the enemy leaders should be shot while trying to escape, the common euphemism for murder used in Hollywood's cheaper films about the Nazis. Eisenhower's naval aide, Harry Butcher, heard his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, an officer who nursed a phenomenal hatred for the Germans, urged that imprisonment was not enough for the enemy's general staff, a body of some 3,500 officers. There was agreement, noted the aide in his unpublished diary, that extermination could be left to nature if the Russians had a free hand. "Why just the Russians?" inquired Eisenhower. The victorious powers, he suggested, could temporarily assign zones in Germany to the smaller nations with scores to settle. He repeated these views to Henry Morgenthau when the latter visited the Portsmouth command post of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, on August the 7th. Indeed, Morgenthau would, with some justification, point to Eisenhower as the father of his famous plan. According to Morgenthau's version, General Eisenhower opposed any soft line. "The whole German population is a synthetic paranoid," he told the Treasury Secretary, "and there is no reason for treating a paranoid gently. The best cure is to let the Germans stew in their own juice." General Eisenhower had stated, Morgenthau told his officials 5 days later, that in his view we must take a tough line with Germany, as we must see to it that Germany was never again in a position to unleash war upon the world. According to another witness, Eisenhower also said, "The ringleaders and the SS troops should be given the death penalty without question, but punishment should not end there." This discussion with the Treasury Secretary prompted the Supreme Commander to dilate on his own views about the basically paranoid German character, which Eisenhower himself later summarized as follows: "The German people must not be allowed to escape a personal sense of guilt for the terrible tragedy that had engulfed the world. Germany's war-making power should be eliminated. Certain groups should be specifically punished by Allied tribunals, leading Nazis, Gestapo members, SS members. He added, the German General Staff should be utterly eliminated, all records destroyed and individuals scattered and rendered powerless to operate as a body. In proper cases, more specifically punished. Morgenthau tackled the British Prime Minister Winston S. Churchill about this 3 days later, over lunch on August 10, 1944. The Prime Minister indicated his general concurrence with Eisenhower's viewpoint. Morgenthau then sketched the outlines of what later became his plan. In his opinion, serious consideration should be given to the desirability and feasibility of reducing Germany to an agrarian economy wherein Germany would be a land of small farms without large-scale industrial enterprises. Morgenthau reported all this to his Washington staff a few days later, one of whom recorded, he said that in his conversation with Churchill, the question of the program to be followed upon occupation of Germany had come up, and that he had gathered from the Prime Minister's comments that he was in agreement with the view expressed by Morgenthau to the effect that during the early months Germany's economy ought to be let pretty much alone and permitted to seek its own level. The Germans were to stew in their own juice, in other words. Morgenthau advised the President on August the 19th, on his return from Europe to Washington, that some people in Europe were planning a soft future for Germany. Roosevelt confidently assured him, "Give me 30 minutes with Churchill and I can correct this." He added, "We have got to be tough with Germany, and I mean the German people, not just the Nazis. You either have to castrate the German people, or you have got to treat them in such a manner so they can't go on reproducing people who want to continue the way they have in the past." The presidential interest in castration is worth bearing in mind. Worried about the rumors that he was hearing, on August 21st, the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, a Republican in a broadly Democrat administration, talked with Roosevelt's special advisor, Harry L. Hopkins, on the telephone. Hopkins, however, asked him to bear with Morgenthau over Germany. Stimson saw every reason to be concerned about the Treasury Secretary's involvement with Germany, and at noon on the 23rd, he went to the President and put to him his own, more measured views. Afterwards, Stimson and his deputy, John G. McCloy, took lunch with Morgenthau at the War Department and listened in disbelief as the latter revealed triumphantly that the dismemberment of Germany had already been agreed upon between the Big Three 18 months earlier at Tehran. This was news not only to Stimson. Although the discovery of this thing, dictated Stimson shortly afterwards into his private diary, has been a most tremendous surprise to all of us, I am not sure that the three chiefs regard it as a fait accompli. In the afternoon, Stimson tried to collect his own thoughts about the future of Germany, drafting a document entitled Brief for Conference with the President on August 25th, in which he listed a number of urgent matters of American policy, including in particular their policy vis-à-vis the liquidation of Hitler and his gang. Stimson's wording was very explicit. Present instructions seem inadequate beyond imprisonment. Our officers must have the protection of definite instructions if shooting is required. If shooting required, it must be immediate, not post-war. He also asked the question, how far do U.S. officers go towards preventing lynching in advance of law and order? Morgenthau got at Roosevelt first, lunching with him at the White House on August 23rd. Here, he filled in more details of his plan for punishing and emasculating post-war Germany, regardless of the effect which this running sore would have on the rest of the European economy. The Treasury Secretary visited Roosevelt early on August 25th to hand him his own memorandum on the German problem. Later that day, he and Stimson both lunched with the President. Stimson again focused attention on the allocation of British and American zones of occupation in Germany. He now urged Roosevelt to dump on the British the occupation of northern Germany. By taking southwestern Germany, he recorded in his diary, we were further away from the dirty work that the Russians might be doing with the Prussians in eastern Germany. Another unsubtle reference to the mopping up or purification operations which the Russians would conduct in their own occupation zone. Worried that Allied troops would shortly be entering Germany without policy directives, Stimson suggested that Roosevelt appoint a cabinet committee. The president took the point, and after lunch all three men went together into cabinet. At the very beginning of this cabinet meeting, Roosevelt announced that he would appoint Secretaries Hull, Morgenthau, and Stimson as the members of that committee. In the ensuing discussion, Stimson felt that he was able to put across his view that any penalties should be inflicted on individuals and not by destruction of the economic structure of Germany, which might have serious results in the future. The president, he recorded discreetly, showed some interest in radical treatment of the Gestapo. There he left it for a while. For the last days of August, Stimson remained on his farm, maintaining scrambler telephone contact with McCloy in Washington. In particular, wrote Stimson in his diary, I was working up and pressing for the point I had initiated, namely, that we should intern the entire Gestapo and perhaps the SS leaders, and then vigorously investigate and try them as the main instruments of Hitler's system of terrorism in Europe. By so doing, I thought we would begin at the right end, namely the Hitler machine, and punish the people who were directly responsible for that, carrying the line of investigation and punishment as far as possible. I found around me, particularly Morgenthau, a very bitter atmosphere of personal resentment against the entire German people, without regard to individual guilt, and I am very much afraid that it will result in our taking mass vengeance on the part of our people in the shape of clumsy economic action. Getting wind of this rising controversy, the British ambassador in Washington, Lord Halifax, sent a telegram to the Foreign Office on September the 1st, reporting that McCloy had told him of the Morgenthau Committee and its preoccupation with the question of the trial and punishment of Hitler, Himmler, and other leading Nazis, as distinct from their mere arrest by Allied military forces. The economic part of what was more properly called the Treasury Plan was drafted by Morgenthau's principal assistant, Harry Dexter White, who was later accused of being a Soviet agent. White completed the first draft on September 1st and sent it over the next day to Morgenthau, who had retired to his country home in upstate New York for the Labor Day weekend, an American public holiday. When President Roosevelt and his wife motored over to take tea with Morgenthau beneath the trees of his estate, the Treasury Secretary showed him the draft. Roosevelt's current thinking on Germany was still rather simplistic. No aircraft, uniforms, or marching. Morgenthau said, "That's very interesting, Mr. President, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough." He wanted to put 18 or 20 million Germans out of work, and he wanted able-bodied Germans transported to Central Africa as slave labor on some big TVA project. The Tennessee Valley Authority hydroelectric project of Roosevelt's New Deal had generated employment for half the continent. How different was the staid, elderly Republican Stimson from the vengeful Democrat Morgenthau. That Monday, September the 4th, the former flew back to Washington and conferred with General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff, about the treatment of Germany and ways of investigating and punishing the Gestapo. It was very interesting, Stimson dictated afterwards in a note, to find that army officers have a better respect for the law in those matters than civilians who are anxious to go ahead and chop everybody's head off without trial or hearing. Invited to dine with Morgenthau that evening, Stimson found McCloy and Harry Dexter White already there. We were all aware of the feeling that a sharp issue is sure to arise over the question of the treatment of Germany. Morgenthau is, not unnaturally, very bitter, and as he is not thoroughly trained in history or even economics, it became very apparent that he would plunge out for a treatment of Germany which I feel sure would be unwise. The next day, the Cabinet Committee on Germany met for the first time in Cordell Hull's office. Hull was reticent, but it turned out that his ideas were no less extreme than Morgenthau's. Stimson found himself in a minority of one. "This proposal," he said of Morgenthau's plan, "will cause enormous evils. The Germans will be permanent paupers, and the hatreds and tensions that will develop will obscure the guilt of the Nazis and poison the springs of future peace." "My plan," retorted Morgenthau, unabashed, "will stop the Germans from ever trying to extend their domination by force again. Don't worry. The rest of Europe can survive without them." Stimson was unconvinced. "This plan will breed war," he said, "not prevent it." To General Marshall he wrote, "It's very singular. I'm the man in charge of the department which does the killing in this war, and yet I am the only one who seems to have any mercy for the other side." Stimson returned to his office and dictated this note for his diary. "As soon as I got into the meeting, it became very evident that Morgenthau had been rooting around behind the scenes and had greased the way for his own views by conference with the President and others. I, to my tremendous surprise, found that Hull was as bitter as Morgenthau against the Germans and was ready to dump all the principles that he had been labouring for in regard to trade for the past 12 years. He and Morgenthau wished to wreck completely the immense Ruhr-Saar area of Germany into a second-rate agricultural land. I found myself a minority of one, and I laboured vigorously but entirely ineffectively against my colleagues. In all the 4 years that I have been here, I have not had such a difficult and unpleasant meeting." It was decided that each of the 3 men would submit to the President a memorandum on the treatment of Germany. Stimson utterly rejected Hull's proposals, which closely tallied with Morgenthau's. "I cannot treat as realistic the suggestion that such an area in the present economic condition of the world can be turned into a non-productive ghost territory when it has become the centre of one of the most industrialised continents in the world, populated by peoples of energy, vigour, and progressiveness." Lord Halifax sent a further telegram to London, briefing the Foreign Office at McCloy's request on what Morgenthau was up to. 2 awesome questions were now being raised, on which the ambassador asked for formal instructions. Whom do we imprison or intern? On what scale? Is it by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands? And more crucially, whom do we shoot or hang? The feeling is that we should not have great state trials, but proceed quickly and with despatch. The English idea, once preferred but then withdrawn, was to give the army lists to liquidate on mere identification. What has happened to this idea? Besides individuals, what categories should be shot? General Marshall was a wise, unhurried soldier-politician. On September 7th, Stimson secured him as an ally. After reading the memorandum which Stimson had received from Morgenthau, demanding, as Stimson summarized it, that the leaders of the Nazi Party be shot without trial and on the basis of the general world appreciation of their guilt, Marshall gave it the reception that his political master had expected. Absolute rejection of the notion that we should not give these men a fair trial. Morgenthau, nonetheless, stuck to his guns and went to the very top, demanding of the President a rehearing. Learning of this, Stimson cast about for other allies. He dined with Justice Felix Frankfurter, one of the 12 members of the Supreme Court and one of Roosevelt's less extreme advisers. Although a Jew, like Morgenthau, dictated Stimson afterwards, he approached this subject with perfect detachment and great helpfulness. He went over the whole matter with the judge from the beginning, reading out Morgenthau's proposals on the future of the Ruhr and on the summary liquidation without trial of the Nazis, at both of which Frankfurter snorted with astonishment and disdain. He fully backed Stimson's views and those of his army generals. The accused Germans, said Frankfurter, were to be given a fair hearing. They cannot be railroaded to their death without trial. The fight, nonetheless, continued. By September the 9th, Morgenthau had his full plan ready, a new diatribe on the subject of how to deal with the Nazis. At a meeting that day with Roosevelt, Stimson waded into it. But the meeting was very unsatisfactory. Hull sat silent. Morgenthau's record shows that Roosevelt said he wanted Germany partitioned into 3 parts. He flipped through the pages of Morgenthau's plan and kept prodding Morgenthau. Where is the ban on uniforms and marching? Morgenthau reassured him it was all there. The President was planning to meet in a few days' time with the British war leadership at Quebec in Canada to decide on these and other matters. He now, as Stimson put it, pranced up to the meeting at Quebec, leaving Hull and Stimson behind. Morgenthau seized the opportunity to share the train journey north with the President as far as Hyde Park, Roosevelt's country home in upstate New York. He wanted to have the last word. What views did Churchill bring with him to Quebec? His cabinet had displayed some differences of attitude on the punishment of enemy war criminals. A number of German prisoners of war had been shot in Britain during the war, but the file on these episodes is closed to public scrutiny. The treatment of the principal enemy leaders was clearly a different matter altogether. The archives show that as early as 1942, Churchill had decided that they should be executed without trial, and he repeatedly canvassed this proposal until long after the war was over, although there is no trace of it in his memoirs. For example, when the British ambassador in Moscow conveyed a Foreign Office statement on the case of Rudolf Hess to Marshal Stalin on November 5, 1942, the Soviet leader put his concerns to Sir Archibald Clark Kerr outright. After the war, it is customary to repatriate prisoners of war. Do you intend to send Hess home? And he added, if Goebbels landed in the UK tomorrow, would you send him back as a POW too? He was perturbed about the plan to set up a United Nations commission to try these criminals. I would not like to see Hitler, Mussolini, and the rest of them escaping like the Kaiser to some neutral country. The German Kaiser had been given sanctuary by the Netherlands after World War I. It was then that His Majesty's ambassador reassured the dictator that Churchill proposed a political decision, whereby the enemy leaders would be liquidated upon capture. Both on this occasion and subsequently when Churchill tried to force this solution on him, Stalin voiced wise objections. Whatever happens, he lectured the ambassador in November 1942, there must be some kind of court decision. Otherwise, people will say that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were wreaking vengeance on their political enemies. I am sure, persisted the ambassador laconically, that the political decision that Mr. Churchill has in mind will be accompanied by all the necessary formalities. This was not an isolated document in which an ambassador had perhaps expressed an opinion without sufficient warrant from his superiors. From both the British and American archives, it becomes clear that the British, from their autocratic Prime Minister Winston Churchill downwards, were set on executing against the Nazi leadership what can only be described as lynch justice without the palliative noun, or alternatively as judicial murder without the exculpatory adjective. It was a matter on which Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, equivocated. Cabinet papers show that in July 1943 he proposed that the United Nations warn all neutral countries that the harbouring of war criminals at any future time would be regarded as an unfriendly act. Responding to this, another cabinet minister, Duff Cooper, pointed out that the United Nations had yet to decide on the fate of Hitler and Mussolini if they should be taken prisoner. By what code and before what tribunal can the head of a conquered state be tried by his victorious opponents? He perhaps naively asked. He predicted that such a trial would drag on interminably, bringing disrepute to the lawyers and sympathy to those in the dock. Hitler, he reminded his cabinet colleagues, had ultimately decided not to put the deposed Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg on trial for precisely this reason. As for the alternative, punishment without trial, Duff Cooper warned that this would shock the consciences of many people at the time and many more in retrospect. Since Hitler and Mussolini would no doubt meet their deaths with dignity, the result would be that their memories would be enshrined forever in the hearts of their people. He argued that it would be infinitely preferable for the Axis leaders to creep into a despised and dishonoured exile than to have trials leading to a St. Helena, or worse, to executions. Duff Cooper quoted historical parallels, showing that the exiles of James II, the Kaiser, and Charles X were fatal to their dynasty, while the harsher punishments meted out to Napoleon, Louis XVI, and Charles I built up legends on which restorations were later founded. In July 1943, after Mussolini's overthrow and arrest, the very real possibility arose that he and his fascist consorts, the head devil together with his partners in crime, as Roosevelt had called them, might fall into Allied hands. "We ought now to decide," Churchill cabled to Roosevelt in consultation with the USSR, "what treatment should be meted out to them. One," he continued, though still treading warily, "may prefer prompt execution without trial, except for identification purposes. Others might, however, prefer that Mussolini and the others be kept in confinement until the end of the war in Europe, and their fate then be decided along with the other war criminals." Not yet having discussed this delicate matter with the President, Churchill professed to be fairly indifferent on this matter, provided that they sacrifice no solid military advantages for the sake of immediate vengeance. Roosevelt responded on this occasion that, in his opinion, a premature effort to seize the head devil would prejudice the primary Allied objective, which was, he reminded the Prime Minister, to get Italy out of the war. In due course, they could set about capturing Mussolini and his assistants. Only then could they determine the individual degrees of guilt for which the punishment should fit the crime. Where did the Lord Chancellor, head of the British legal structure, stand on this? Parroting his master's voice, Viscount Simon agreed with Churchill. The enemy leaders should be put to the sword. When he saw Lord Halifax on September 9, 1943, Simon said that if action were ever to be taken against Hitler or Mussolini, it could be done only on the basis of a United Nations declaration as a political act, that is, outright execution without trial. Whether that would be wise or not, remarked Lord Halifax dubiously in his diary, is another matter. One other thing is certain, that it would be very difficult to explain to the ordinary public why you shot the man who burnt Lidice and did not shoot Hitler. Part of the decision-making process was easy. Following Churchill's lead, on October 8th, the Cabinet decided that any lesser war criminals whom the Allies captured should be turned over to be punished locally in the country where they had committed their crimes. Churchill thoroughly approved this. It would shift the burden of administering retribution, he did not use the word justice, from the hands of the Allies to those of the countries which had suffered. Eden, however, as Foreign Secretary, listened to the Cabinet debate with misgivings. He was just off to confer with the other Allied foreign ministers in Moscow. "I am far from happy about all this war criminals business," he minuted the next day. "When I come back, I want to have a departmental discussion about it all. Broadly, I am most anxious not to get into the position of breathing fire and slaughter against war criminals, and promising condign punishment and a year or two hence have to find a pretext for doing nothing." Nonetheless, Churchill drafted a solemn declaration, which he submitted to both Roosevelt and Stalin on October 12, 1943, undertaking to cart back all the minor enemy war criminals to the location of their atrocities, where they should be put on trial. He published the text of this draft in his memoirs. Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union have received from many quarters evidence of the atrocities, massacres, and cold-blooded mass executions which are being perpetrated by the Hitlerite forces in the many countries which they have overrun and from which they are now being steadily expelled. The brutalities of the Nazi domination are no new thing, and all peoples of territories in their grip have suffered from the worst forms of government by terror. What is new is that many of these territories are now being redeemed by the advancing armies of the liberating powers, and that in their desperation the recoiling Hitlerites and Huns are redoubling their ruthless cruelties. Accordingly, continued Churchill's draft, the three powers, speaking in the interest of the 32 United Nations, declared that at the time of any armistice with Germany, those Germans who had been responsible for the atrocities will be sent back to the countries in which their abominable deeds were done. Thus, Germans taking part in the wholesale shooting of Italian officers, a neat contemporary touch, or in the execution of French, Dutch, Belgian, or Norwegian hostages and so on, will know that they will be brought back, regardless of expense, a less neat turn of phrase, to the scene of their crimes and judged on the spot by the peoples whom they have outraged. The above declaration, he was careful to end, is without prejudice to the case of the major criminals, whose offences have no particular geographical localization. Eden carried Churchill's draft to Moscow, and, with minor amendments, it was adopted as the declaration issued there at the end of the foreign ministers' meeting on October 30th. This Moscow declaration became the basis of the post-war disposition of many of the German war criminals, though not of the Italian and Japanese. Churchill expressed relief at this, telling the Cabinet, "I am certain that the British at any rate would be incapable of carrying out mass executions for any length of time, especially as we have not suffered like the subjugated countries." This left unresolved the awkward problem of how to deal with the major war criminals, particularly those whose offences, however, have no particular geographical localization, the major criminals, like Hitler. For these, the Prime Minister reverted, in November 1943, to his own final solution. A list, he suggested, shall be compiled by the United Nations of all major criminals other than those provided for by local jurisdiction. This growing list, of 50 or at the most 100 names, would include the Hitler and Mussolini gangs and the Japanese warlords. From time to time at a conference of jurists, the lists would be pruned, added to, and approved. Thereafter, the persons named on the approved list will, by solemn decree of the 32 United Nations, be declared world outlaws. The beauty of this proposal was that the outlaws could be liquidated at will. No penalty will be inflicted on anyone who puts them to death in any circumstances. As and when any of these persons falls into the hands of any of the troops or armed forces of the United Nations, suggested Churchill, the nearest officer of the rank or equivalent rank of Major General will forthwith convene a court of inquiry, not for the purpose of determining the guilt or innocence of the accused, but merely to establish the fact of identification. Once identified, the said officer will have the outlaw or outlaws shot to death within 6 hours and without reference to higher authority.